Welcome to Pizza Dough Boot Camp. My name's Tom Santos, Bill Weekley. We're going to talk about dough, 2 seminars. The first one's going to be this morning about ingredient functionality, and then we'll go over some dough making in the afternoon. Bill and I are part of a team called the Dominators. That picture's a little dated. The gentleman in the yellow shirt, Tim Huff, retired a couple years ago. So we sort of have to get an update on that shirt.
And I was about 30 pounds lighter.
Yeah. I actually, if you look at that picture, I parted my hair on this side versus this side. So a little about myself, and Bill and I will tell you just a little history. I started in the baking business in 1980. My then fiance and now wife opened a small little bakery in Connecticut and grew it to a pretty large size. So we started in 1980. In 1986, we bought a building and expanded our business into there. And then in 1997, the Pillsbury Company came by and made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So went to work for the Pillsbury Company. And during that time in the bakery, we made everything from bread, rolls, pizzas, cakes, pies, really used everything with flour. So really familiar with dough. 2001, General Mills bought Pillsbury, and now here I am 40 years later. I cover national accounts for General Mills. Been a great ride, and we're looking forward to talking to you about dough. Bill?
My name is Bill Weekley. I think we have 35 or 40,000 people in the company of General Mills, but I'm the only certified master baker in the whole group. There's only about 200 of them in North America. So I don't know all the answers by any means, but I sure know people that can find out for you. So if you have questions, please feel free to ask. I've been with General Mills about 12 years. Prior to that, I worked for a large yeast company for about 24. So I've been doing tech service since 1981. Started in the industry in 1966, and I'm 29 this year. So it's been a great ride. I love doing this. I love baking. I love baking bread. I love making pizzas. Right now, most of what I do is R&D, or research and development, for our group, and the majority of the work I work on is actually cakes and donuts, but got to do something. But this is my 31st year at Pizza Expo, and I think this is the 25th or 26th year I've done these boot camps. So we're here to help. That's all we really want to do, and we want to help you understand what it is that you're trying to do with your pizzas. For just out of curiosity, how many of you are new to the industry? That always blows my mind. That's a lot of people. How many of you have been in it more than 10 years? That's cool too. So, oh yeah. Can everybody shut their phones off, or at least put them on silent for us? Because it does get a little annoying when you got about 100 people in here and there's only 64 chairs. Sorry about that. But we're here to try to help you in any way we can, and we also will be at the booth when we're not in here. Our booth is 1133. It's if you go right across the hall and walk through the doors where you can't get through right now, we're right in that area. So, and we're more than happy to answer questions for you and talk to you on the phone if you're afraid to ask questions in front of people or whatever. So most of you are not that shy.
No.
So,
like Bill said with the phones, please ask questions. Just raise your hand. We're going to try and answer as many as we can. We have 90 minutes, so we want to respect everybody's time. It's a busy day for everybody. We want to make sure we have it done in 90 minutes. We'll stay after a little bit, so if you have a question, you could come up, okay? The big thing is we want to share. We want to learn. We learn every time we do this, we learn something. So hopefully we can impart some of our knowledge, and you can impart some of your knowledge, and hopefully we could have a few laughs too. Our dough making demo will be at our booth, 1133. We'll do one at 12, and we do one at 1:30. And what you're going to learn at that dough making demo is both the functionality of the ingredients we're doing now, And then how, in the second half, the afternoon session, we'll show you how to mix dough. So if you go to the dough demo and you could take both courses, you'll have a pretty good basis on how to make dough. The one thing I will say about the dough demo, this is our disclaimer. How many people here have a pizza operation and let people handle dough? Give like a piece of dough. Don't do that.
Customers.
Yeah. Don't give customers. It's in the industry, the flour industry, the milling industry, you don't want to handle raw dough with customers because of bacteria problems. It has to be baked to kill the salmonella. So that's our public service announcement. If you do hand out raw dough to little kids, probably a good idea to stop doing that. Okay, and if you're thinking of doing it, probably you don't want to do that. It's our contact information. So if you have a question, or you could email us. We have an 800 number. If you come up after the show or after we're done here, we have business cards. You could always contact us.
Sorry.
All right, let's get started. It's ingredient functionality. This is the part one, the morning session. And Bill will go into some formulations. And if we have time, we'll talk about some specialty ingredients. Whether it's a complete mix, dough packs, or complete scratch, you want to know what those ingredients are doing in your dough. A complete mix is exactly what it sounds. Everything is in that bag. You're just adding water. You're adding water, you're dumping the bag. Some of them have yeast, some of them don't. So the most you would add with a complete mix is water and yeast. Dough packs would take your formula and they would weigh out your salt, your sugar, any emulsifiers you're putting in, and put them in these little dough packs. So what you would do is you put your water in, your dough pack, your flour, yeast on top, and mix it. It's just a way for consistent scaling. Usually larger operations do that. 95% of the independents we come across are complete scratch. So you're weighing out everything. You're weighing out from the beginning to the end. And in the afternoon session, we're going to talk about how important weighing out stuff is. Right now, we're going to talk about what the ingredients do for your dough. 4 primary ingredients to make a dough. You have flour, water, salt, and yeast. That's all you need to make a dough. Most places will add sugar and salt depending on the area. The Neapolitan styles flour pizzas would only use the 4 primary ingredients. You need all 4 of them, because if you mix a dough without salt, it's going to taste awful. If you mix a dough without yeast, it's just going to sit there. So you need all 4 of them. We're going to go through how they work in your dough. Flour, since we're a flour company, is the first thing we're going to lead off with, and is the most, probably other than water, is the most important part of your dough. It provides the structure to your dough. When you mix flour with water and mix it together, the protein, and we're going to be talking about that coming up, develops gluten. So you've all heard high gluten flour, mid-protein flours. When you don't develop gluten until you mix the dough with water, or mix the flour with water. The gluten is your extendability. Think of a rubber band. The more protein, the more gluten, the more stretch. And the key with the gluten, and I'm going to be talking a lot about this, I always talk about a basketball net. If you think of a basketball net, think of how a basketball net looks, like that webbing of a basketball net. When you properly develop your dough, that webbing holds in the gas, and that gas, the CO2 gas created from the yeast, from the fermentation, stays in your dough rather than leaves into the air, and that's what gives the dough the great flavor. We're going to talk a little about flour types. I'm going to start, if you look at our little chart there, all-purpose bread flour, high gluten. The top all-purpose is a winter wheat. There's 2 types of wheat. You have winter wheat and you have spring wheat. Winter wheat, planted in the fall, late fall, then it goes dormant over the winter. Now this is planted in Kansas, Nebraska, the middle of the country. Goes dormant over the winter, and now it's just going to start emerging, and it's going to be harvested sometime in May. Because it's planted in a temperate climate, a little cooler, it doesn't have the strength. It doesn't have as much protein. Protein develops in wheat with heat. So winter wheat, because it's planted dormant over the winter, harvested in the spring, doesn't get a lot of heat. So it's more of a mellow, tender type dough. That would be your all-purpose H&R flour. Your bread flour or patent flour or high gluten flour, those are spring wheats. Spring wheats are planted in probably early May, go through the summer, and then they're harvested in the early fall. Now, spring wheats, they're in the upper part, Minnesota, Montana, that area, upper Midwest, but there's more stretch to them because they're planted and they rise over the summer with all that heat. That heat creates more protein, which gives you a higher gluten flour. So if you know, the reason I tell you that, look at the protein level. All-purpose, winter wheat, little lower protein. Now, as you move up the protein scale to the spring wheats, your bread flour and high gluten go from 12 to 14%. Always think more stretch, more protein. The gluten strength obviously corresponds to the percentage. And when we say dough strength, we mean the texture of the dough. A little softer as you move up the gluten scale. And one thing you'll notice, the absorption potential. Now, we do everything in baker's percent. Bill's going to go over that in about 15 minutes. Everything we talk about is baker's percent because it makes it a lot easier to, if you have a problem and you call us, we're going to ask you for your formula. And if we could break it out in baker's percent, it makes it a lot easier to figure out what the issues are. Bill's going to touch base for probably 15 minutes about that. The key is, if you look at the lower protein, look at the amount of water, 48 to 52%. You move to the higher proteins, you're up towards 60% of water. So the more protein, the more water your dough could absorb. Depending on the type of pizza you're making, water's free. We charge you for flour. If you could add an extra quart of water, it's 2 pounds. An extra quart of water to any dough is 2 pounds. That's a dough ball, a little over a dough ball. You multiply that by 10 bags a day and keep going. It could be significant savings for you. So we're going to have a separate chart on this going down the road on mixing, but that winter wheat, spring wheat, those are the differences. Your all-purpose flour it's a general use flour. We see breading in the food service industry. When you think of an all-purpose flour, think of a dinner roll. You have a little dinner roll. When you bite into it, a little bit chewy but very tender. A lot different. It doesn't fight you. So lower protein, not as much stretch, not as much chew. A soft dinner roll, a focaccia bread, a Chicago deep dish pizza. When you stretch your dough on the table, a high protein dough is going to snap back a little bit because of the extra protein, the gluten. An all-purpose dough, not as much protein, it's going to not snap back, it's going to stay there a little bit better. And it's going to be able to absorb a little bit more toppings on it, especially the Chicago deep dish pizza. Tender, think of a nice tender, it doesn't have that chew that you're fighting. That's your all-purpose flour. Now, the Neapolitan style flours is also in that winter wheat. And remember, we had 48 to 52% on the absorption, the amount of water. On a Neapolitan style crust, we're working, about 64? In 64% area. 66. That means for every 100 pounds of flour, using 64 pounds of water. So it can absorb it. It depends on the type of pizza you're making, and we'll go into that a little more. High protein flour, from where I'm from the East Coast, and high protein flour is pretty much where we sell in the New York metro area. We sell a ton of high protein flour, even down in Florida. High protein flour, there's no actual standard by the government saying that you could call something high protein or high gluten. There's actually no standard. It's an industry accepted practice. 10 to 12 is all-purpose, 12 to 13 is a patent or bread flour. Anything over 13% protein is considered high gluten. High gluten is a little more tolerant to mixing because you have a little insurance with the extra gluten or the extra protein. So if you're mixing a lower protein dough and you overmix it by a minute or two, you may lose the dough because it doesn't have the strength. Remember we had the chart there. It said dough strength, low dough strength. High protein flour, a lot more strength. a lot more stretch. When you think of a high protein flour, anybody here from New York? I'm the only one?
One person?
Anybody ever have a New York bagel? We call them jawbreakers. That's a high protein flour. So remember we were talking about soft dinner roll. High protein flour, think of a bagel. It's chewy. You gotta work it a little bit. So if you're making a New York style pizza, the one you fold, you need that extra protein to hold that crust. A winter wheat flour really wouldn't be able to do that. The extra protein is going to give you the stretch. Now, the more protein, the more cost. Protein does cost money. But the higher protein, the fermentation, it also gives you that netting again. You have that netting on your dough, so when you put a topping, the sauce doesn't go through. Bakes a nice crisp crust with a nice chew. Always think of chew when you're thinking of the higher protein. The classic New York style pizza, I'm dating myself, but it's, when Kramer was walking down Fifth Avenue with the pizza going after Jerry Seinfeld saying, Jerry, 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 that's your typical New York style pizza, and you would use a high protein flour for it. Do you have any questions as we're going along? Yes?
For your bread, I use Ultram because I try to do New York style.
Yeah.
For your bread, which one would you recommend? Ultram or which one?
For like a New York style pizza?
Yes.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Yeah, all Trumps are perfect.
Also, I make a blending between high gluten and all-purpose flour.
Okay.
Is that okay, or do you recommend a percentage between both?
If it works for you, it's okay. If you want to blend flours, that's fine. If it's successful, the last thing Bill and I will ever do here is tell you what you're doing that's successful may not work. What you might want to do, if you want to use a little lower protein flour, is go to the next flour, which I'm going to talk about, is a bread flour. It's right in between. So what you're doing is blending a high protein down a little bit. We actually have flours, or most millers have flours which are called patent flours or bread flours. And they're right in between, that 14 to 10. So you actually led into the next slide. You did a great job there. Thank you. And we call it this patent flour, bread flour, bakers call it patent flour, go-between flour. And in New England, it is the most popular flour, much more popular than the high protein. New England, it tends to have a little bit of a softer mouthfeel when you're making a pizza. So remember, we have the bagel over here, chewy. You got to work at it. We have the dinner roll over here, sort of soft. Think of a hard roll. Hard roll, you bite into, nice crisp hard roll. Bite into it. You're not going to chew it like a bagel, but it's certainly going to have more chew than a dinner roll. So it's right in between. When you make a New York style pizza, sort of a similar formula we call them New England pan pizzas. It's going to have just a little bit of a softer mouthfeel, a little softer tooth when you bite into it. You bite into the crust, you're going to get a little chew, but you're not going to get that chew of a New York style pizza. And it stretches. You can make a great thin crust with a patent flour, a mid-protein flour. Yes, sir. That's a winter wheat, your 00 flour. It's a winter wheat, so it would be like the all-purpose area in that 10 to 12% range.
On average, it runs about 11.7 in protein.
Yeah, but its characteristics are completely different than AT.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's more of a, kind of falls in that red flour.
Yeah, it's a hard red winter wheat.
Yeah.
Not a soft wheat. So
There's no soft wheat blended into it. It's just straight hard wheat, pretty much.
lower protein hard wheat.
Yeah. But still a winter wheat. Yes? Yeah. Well, white flour, yeah. We're actually going to have a couple slides coming up on that. Yeah, white flour versus whole wheat or whole grain. White flour is... Which one? Well, without going, you have hard wheat, soft wheat. Soft wheat would be for cakes, that type of thing. Hard wheat tends to be for more doughs. You have spring wheat, winter wheat. All of it's white except whole grain, semolinas, that type of thing. But if you see white flour is white flour. It's usually one of those three that we were just talking about. Well, it depends what type of bread you want to make. If you're using like an all-purpose flour and you're making a loaf of bread, it's not going to be as chewy. Like a good loaf of Italian bread where I come from, believe it or not, it's mostly patent flour.
Yeah.
You would think it would be a higher protein flour, but it's actually a patent flour. And the key with bread, what I know we're talking about, is the steam. I mean...
Yeah. But the other thing, too, is when you're working with all-purpose flours as opposed to bread flours or high-gluten flours, you can't get, if it's a freestanding loaf of bread, it's not going to stand up very high. It's going to tend to collapse on you at that lower protein. So if you want something that holds up, like a nice Italian loaf or French loaf, you want to be using something at least that's a hard red winner and something in the 12% range or above.
Before I get into semolina, I'm just going to touch... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't want to hold you up.
No.
The gentleman over here asked about O and double O flour.
Mm-hmm.
We import all our flour, we do Neapolitan. Do you have Albion-Graph spec sheets for U.S. produced flour? I've never seen it because there's more to it than just the hydration and the protein. For me, I've got to look at other factors too, and I've been able to find it, so I'm forced to bring it in.
We do them for Harvest King, which is what we would call our Neapolitan flour as well, except the Neapolitan flour is clean. There's nothing added to it. Harvest King does
enrichment.
Avon does enrichment and malt for Harvest King, but it's the only one that we really do anything as far as alveographs are concerned, because we really only sell that through the artisan baking field. Well, that's not true, but we sell it in a lot of locations, but as far as doing alveographs on them, it's a very expensive, long process to do. So we keep it to things that people actually are going to question, and that's mostly the European-style bakers.
No, that's by all means. No, we want questions.
Question, does the oven make a difference on New York style, whether you're using any of these kind of...
Well, ovens generally are going to make whatever type of pizza are going to make a difference of whatever type of oven you're using. What type of oven are you using? A what? Okay. You could take a dough, mix a dough and bake it in 4 different types of oven, and you're going to get probably 4 different types of pizza. That's the question that whatever works best for you. Are you looking for something different with your pizza, or?
Well, as you said, as long as the crust holds up, so that's the...
Yeah. Do you bake it on the hearth, or do you bake it?
It's just a regular conveyor, chain drive.
Yeah. Okay.
If you're going to question about oven types and things like that, I think we should probably divert to the oven manufacturers.
Yeah.
We know what works best for us, but it may not be what you want. So.
And we know a lot of really good people in the industry that could help you with that question.
Yeah. There are a ton of oven companies here this time.
Flour has nothing to do with...
No, that's not true. It also is part of it, but you have to pick a specific oven, and then we can probably give you a much more pointed answer to the question.
But if you're going from like a conveyor oven to a hot deck oven, there's going to be a difference in the way that the dough bakes and the bite of the pizza.
Yeah, but my question was, I already have a conveyor, so what do you recommend now that you already know?
Generally speaking, it's bread flour.
Yeah.
There's sometimes some high gluten flour used, but high gluten flour tends to sort of pita out a little bit. So you're dragging the tops of the ingredients off of it as it comes out of the oven.
What temperature do you bake at? Just out of curiosity.
Temperature?
Yeah.
Okay. It's usually between 425 and 470, 475. Then if you get into wood-fired ovens, you're pushing anywhere between 560 and 900. Bake time's a little faster, a lot more complicated to operate. 900 is a really hard temperature to bake pizza at. Even though that's where they want the Neapolitan pizzas to be baked at, it's still tough. Mm-hmm.
Before I go into the semolina, I'm going to talk briefly on treatments. Flour's treated, mostly you'll see bleaching, bromating, enrichment. Enrichment started during the Second World War. The American diet became so poor with the Second World War that the government asked that the millers, all the minerals that were taken out during the milling process, to put them back in. So enrichment, you'll see most flours in America are enriched. Bleaching just makes the flour whiter. What happens is, years ago, before bleaching, the millers would mill the flour and let it naturally oxidize. So it would go over to the side of the warehouse for 4 or 5 weeks, and it would oxidize, turn white. Now, when we say bleaching, we're not taking a bottle of Clorox and throwing it into the flour. It's, very minute parts per million, but turns it white. Just moves the process along. Bleaching for cake flour is very important. For bakery or pizza, not quite as important. Bromate, we call it the baker's helper. Bromate has a very negative connotation right now, and whatever side of you, we're not here to say anything on that. What I will tell you is, and Bill and I have worked on this for 10 years now, the clean label thing is here to stay.
Yep.
If you're using bleach and bromate, we have no problem with it. But my phone, I get a call, at least 1 to 2 calls a week across the United States, asking how do I stop using bleach and bromate. And it's pretty easy. It really is. Something you should consider. Clean label, when people ask about that, there's places, again, I'm from the East Coast, and there's places there that bakers who use a bromated flour can't sell to certain schools. They won't accept it. So as you're looking, the West Coast, we don't see bromate out here at all, pretty much.
In fact, we don't even mill it with bromate in it west of the Mississippi.
So that's something, if you're out east, and New York especially, New York, New England is pretty much the last holdout, and somewhat in Florida. It's starting to move, but if you have a pizzeria, and with social media, the way social media is today, if somebody decides, oh, you're using bleach and bromate, and that's an easy fix, and we could certainly talk to you about it. It's not really that much a change of your formula. The one thing, if you stop using bleach flour, you're going to notice just a little slight color difference in the bowl. It's going to bake out fine, unless you really have to be looking for it.
It's just slightly creamier color. It's not so much white like the paper that you're looking at now.
It's more rustic. It looks like wheat's supposed to look. So again, we're just bringing it up. Those are the functions of bleach bromate enrichment. If you are using bleach and bromate, didn't want to scare you. If it's working for you, that's fine. But if you have a question, it's something you should be looking at moving forward. I'll talk a little about semolina. It's a granular product, durum flour, mostly used for pasta. And when I talk about this, every year I talk about it. I have a customer, and one day a week he makes semolina pizza. Makes, 100 dough balls, whatever. And it's on his slowest day, and he always offers that semolina. When he sold out, he sold out. And semolina pizza, I love semolina pizza. It has like a little nutty taste to it. It has a nice little different color, like a golden color to it. And it adds, when we were talking about the chew of the pizza, it adds like a little bit of a bite to it. It's just when you bite into it, you can feel it. And it's something that if you want to add to your menu, you may not want to do it every day, but you may want to do it once a week on a slow night, see how it works out. Semolina is very, very popular now too. It's coming more and more. I don't know if it's because of the granular aspect or the color, but for some of the artisan type pizzas, a lot of people are using that semolina. The usage level is 10 to 30%. Bill's going to go over that with the baker's percentage. And it's also an excellent dusting flour. And you could tell I was a baker because this is the way we do this, like throwing a fastball. Great for the peel. And I'll give you, we also have another flour. It's called Wondra. And it's a little secret. Don't let it out of the room. But it comes in a little canister. You buy it in the supermarket. And essentially, it's flour that's encapsulated. So if you want to use on your peel, you just put it on, and everything comes off, doesn't burn on the oven. If you don't want to use semolina, Wondra flour is a great flour for that.
Or even a blend of it, semolina and Wondra.
Even better. And buy the shaker. So once you have the shaker, then it comes in a 50-pound.
Then you can get it in a 50-pound bag.
You won't burn in a wood fire like 900 degrees?
Pretty much everything burns at 900 degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll put the caveat on
I
that.
have it, because of dusting flour.
Sure.
Like fish flour, and it burns less than a regular double zero flour.
Right.
You're using that fish flour.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Did you everybody hear? You want to say that again? Did you hear him?
I use it as a bench flour semolina in my 900-degree wood fire oven, and it'll burn less if I use it as like a dusting flour than like a double zero will. It actually helps out quite a bit.
Thank you.
Semolina is very high in protein, but it's very poor at gluten-forming proteins. So if you add it to a dough, you will have to add more water to it, to the dough itself, but it takes it longer to hydrate fully, so you may have to let the dough rest a little bit longer before you actually start to use it.
The whole wheat flour we want to talk about, General Mills, we're a whole grain company. I mean, if you eat Cheerios, you eat Lucky Charms, which are magically delicious, one of my favorite cereals. Yellow Heart, the Yellow Moons, they're better than the Green Clovers, as far as I'm concerned. But a lot of things are going whole grain now. And, that's been over the past few years. And if you don't offer a whole wheat style pizza or a whole, we'll get into the whole grain style pizza, but a whole wheat style pizza, you might be missing something here. And let me explain as far as what a whole grain product is. And to answer somebody asked a question about the white flour. When a miller mills flour, say my fist is a kernel of wheat. When a miller mills, the blade comes and chops. This whole kernel is covered with bran. It chops the bran off. And inside the bran, about 80% of that is white flour. It's called endosperm. So that's what the miller's trying to get with the white flour. And it gets sifted. It goes through if you ever saw a milling operation, it's floor after floor, loud. You can't believe how loud it is. To get a bag of flour, you would never believe how long it takes. But a whole grain, a regular white flour, that's the objective, to get the endosperm, to get you the white flour. A whole grain flour is you take the whole kernel and pulverize it. The bran, the endosperm, the germ, everything, boom, totally pulverized. That's why it's called a whole grain food. Now, the third line here, it says, adds flavor and texture. People argue a little about the flavor. It does add flavor, but there's two types of whole wheat flavor. You have red whole wheat, which is the typical whole wheat that you're used to seeing. The dough comes out a little browner. And that's because that whole wheat kernel has tannins. Those tannins have a bitter taste. And that what gives it that unique taste of a whole wheat flour. There's also white whole wheat. White whole wheat is a yellowish kernel, doesn't have the tannins. So when you use white whole wheat flour, it has a much more mellow taste. It doesn't have that bitter taste. And a lot of the companies now, when they want to use some whole grain flour, they're using the white whole wheat because they're getting the benefit of the whole grain without that bitter taste. If you decided to use the red whole wheat, we're going to talk about adding sweeteners because you definitely do need sweeteners with that. And it adds obviously some texture to the pizza. Usage level, I'll let Bill go into that when we're talking. Always, when you see these 20, 30, 40%, keep those in mind when Bill's talking about baker's percentage shortly.
I promise I'll confuse you. That's my job.
You're going to have to do some formula adjustments when you're using whole wheat flour. Every 10% of whole wheat flour, you're going to have to up the water a little bit because of the bran. The bran needs to hydrate. You don't have all that bran in regular white flour. You need to hydrate that bran in order to make the dough work. And it says often increase in sweeteners, 95% are honey. Everybody uses honey. For some reason, whole wheat and honey seem to be the way to work, especially in the pizza industry. Percentage-wise, we're pretty high with sweeteners in whole wheat flour, and you need to be pretty high because if you don't put sweeteners in, let me tell you, it's not the greatest thing ever.
Have any of you actually made pizza with 100% whole wheat flour? One. There's a reason there's only one. Yeah. Usually Yeah, he just tried it. He didn't actually continue making it. The bitterness of that flour is so strong that it actually takes away from the flavor of the sauces and the meats and cheeses that you add to it. So if you are going to use whole wheat flour in your dough, I'd suggest you keep it at less than 50% of the total flour weight and use white whole wheat flour if you can. Almost all of the whole wheat or whole grain products we make for our K through 12 group, which is kindergarten through 12th grade, we don't even use red whole wheat anymore. It's all white whole wheat because you can't get a kid to eat wheat ever. It's like trying to give them raisins. They just don't eat them. So.
Now, you're going to have to make a few process adjustments when you're making a whole wheat dough. And remember when I told you whole grain, it's crushed, it's pulverized. On a microscopic level, the bran that covers the wheat kernel acts like little knives when the gluten's developing. So as you're mixing the dough, that bran is destroying your gluten production. So what happens is you want a short mix with a whole wheat flour. And there's a thing, it's called autolyse. Usually what you would want to do, you don't want to mix it a lot. You would want to add just your water, your whole wheat flour, mix it for about 3 minutes and let it set a half hour. That allows the bran to soak in the water, soften the dough a little, add your ingredients, mix it out 2 or 3 minutes, get it done, ball it out, and you'll get a much better dough out of that. The reason being, you're not destroying that gluten network by mixing it 5 or 7 minutes. You're letting the absorption do it for you. You're not going to have a lot of absorption, a lot of fermentation time. You're going to make that dough, and you better use it within, I would say, 24 hours. There's just not enough structure to that dough where you could use it the next day. And you're also not going to, we were talking about 100% whole wheat. If you go 100% whole wheat flour, it's tough to eat. I mean, it's like cardboard. There's not a lot of structure. I mean, you could probably sauce this up pretty well.
You got a better shot at eating that.
Yeah, it's a little rough. One last thing on the whole wheat, our other disclaimer. If you're adding anything but whole wheat flour, unless it's 100% whole wheat flour, you cannot label it whole wheat or whole grain. Now, the odds of a USDA inspector or an FDA inspector walking into your business saying you're not labeling that is slim to none, but you just don't want it to happen. It's a very, very tight window. If you're using even if you use 10% white flour, you can't label it whole grain, okay? Just label it wheaten pizza, whole wheat style pizza. Just do not call it whole grain.
You can even call it a wheat pizza. You just can't call it whole grain.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No.
You can't call whole wheat.
No.
You know,
you call it sort of whole wheat, I guess. Kind of whole wheat, but Bill's going to get into the water and, the flour portion of this is done. Bill's going to get into the other ingredients. Do you have any questions before Bill comes up? Okay, thank you.
Anybody getting tired of standing? You can borrow one chair.
Yeah.
So, what's water do in your dough? It's basically in there for hydration. It's a solvent for all the minor ingredients and the flour that are in there, and it's for temperature control. Does anybody check their dough temperatures at all? Good. We're going to look at you very strangely if you don't check your dough temperatures after our conversation, because it's really important for control. But first, we're going to talk about baker's percent. If you look at baker's percent, every ingredient that's in the formula, if you look at that center line, that's true percent. Everything in that formula will add up to 100% at the bottom. If it's baker's percent, the flour is always 100%. If you're using two varieties of flour, you add them together to get your 100%. Let's say you're doing a 50-50 blend of all-purpose and high gluten. 50% of that is part of that 100%, the other 50% is the other part. The reason that we do that is because we're kind of weird in the baking industry. It's so much easier for us to have a 50-pound bag of flour or a 100-pound bag of flour and say, I want 2% salt in this particular formula. In this case, if you were doing true percent, it would only be 1.2%. So the guys that I work with in our lab, the scientists that I work with, I am not a scientist, I'm an engineer. They don't like me very much because they always have to put another row in on their Excel spreadsheets so that I can understand what the heck they're talking about. And it just makes it so much easier to look at a formula and be able to tell exactly what's in it, very simply. Some people still like true percent, but I can't stand it. It's so much easier to convert a formula from, in many cases, cups, salad bowls, trash cans, buckets, than it is to do it in true percent. Yes?
How close to 50 pounds, what variance on those bags of flour do you find?
We are absolutely perfect every time.
You're an engineer, so I know you.
They're overscaled by about 3 to 5 ounces on general, so they're a little heavy.
So just 3 to 5 ounces.
Yeah. Over time, they will lose some of the moisture that's in the flour itself. They come out of the mill at about 14% moisture. I work in a lab that has about 17% relative humidity in it. So I blink a lot because I can't see anything after I've been there for 5 minutes. That flour can actually drop to about 11% moisture in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. All that requires you to do is add more water to the formula. So if you're adjusting water in your formula, you can do it pretty easily. So I know this is a little bit confusing. It's the part that we confuse everybody with every year, but it's kind of important. And if you have your formulas and you want us to look at them and tell you if we think they're within a specific range for you, we can convert those into Baker's percent for you and make it more simple for you to understand why we do it. So if you want to stop by the booth, we're happy to help. Most of the guys in the booth are bakers or ex-bakers. Now they've decided that they don't really want to work that hard, so they're in sales. So
yeah, keeps us employed.
The salt, the basic function in the dough for salt is flavor enhancement and fermentation control. But it also has a tightening effect in the flour protein. So the more salt you put into it, the more tenacity you have on the dough. It makes it tighter. Usually the usage on salt is somewhere around 1 to 2.5%. I have seen one pizza dough in my whole life that was at 4%, but you knew it the minute you bit into it. It was definitely one of those squeeze your lips together things. It wasn't very much fun. Sugar's in there basically as food for the yeast. Usage level is anywhere from 0 to 5%. I rarely see them at 5% unless we're working for frozen dough. Instant yeast is going to be down in the 0.3 to 0.75 range. Active dry yeast, which I'm going to explain to you a little bit more in a second what the major differences are between them, is usually around 0.75 to 1.5, and compressed yeast is usually between 1 and 3. Just remember I'll explain that later. We'll go on to that. Oil is basically in there as lubrication for the gluten strands. It is extensibility. It allows your dough to, because of that lubrication within the gluten strands itself, it allows the dough to stretch a little bit more effectively. It adds some browning effect. It adds tenderness. If you're running slices under a hot lamp, you're going to probably want to have oil in there or it's going to dry out on you. And then it adds keeping quality. Yeast. Its main function in the dough is leavening action. As a yeast actually metabolizes sugar and starts to eat food, It basically creates about 51% CO2 and 49% ethanol. So that's what its main function is to make the dough rise with CO2. It acts as a dough conditioner. Easiest way to explain that is, how does your dough feel the minute it comes off the mixer? It's this tight, very close-knit family of dough. But as it ages, it will actually cause it to soften and stretch more effectively. If you do dough balls and you're refrigerating the dough balls, which seems to be the most common way of making doughs nowadays, the dough will actually start as a big ball and it will eventually flatten out down to where, and that's that relaxation time. And then it adds flavor and aroma. You don't want a bad flavor and aroma in pizza. So if you add too much yeast to it, you can create flavors that just aren't known in the real world. It's not cool. It is a living organism. It hopefully is the only living organism in your dough. Because if there's others in there, we can't help you with that one. That's a science project that we don't do much with. And in order for it to be that living organism and function and do all the things that we want it to do in your dough, it has to be kept happy. And that means temperature, food for the yeast, whatever that may be. And there is enough sugar or sweetness in flour to create that flavor, or create that yeast, or food for the yeast. What affects yeast activity? The amount of yeast, the temperature of the yeast, the fermentation time, and the salt and sugar concentrations. Salt can have a detrimental effect on yeast activity because it tends to cause the yeast cell to squeeze or tighten up. So it can't pass moisture or food across the membrane. Sugar, at lower concentrations, it's perfectly great for food. At higher concentrations, it creates osmotic pressure and prevents the cell from being able to move water back and forth across it, or food. How many of you are using instant yeast? Wow. That's probably the lowest number I've seen in a long time. How about active dry yeast? That's cool. How about compressed yeast or fresh block yeast? That's going downhill a long time. Instant yeast was basically created back in the mid-70s. It was a change to active dry. It was dried slightly differently. It was a smaller particle size. It did not have to be rehydrated. So you can add instant yeast right to the top of the flour bowl, or to the bowl on top of the flour, so it doesn't come in direct contact with the water, and it will hydrate itself. It dissolves quickly. It can be added, you can actually add it to sugar and salt and put it on top of the flour, and it'll be fine. It's not going to go nuts on you. Doesn't have to be rehydrated, but it is the most consistent yeast that you can buy on the market today. And the reason it is because it's grown, because yeast is not manufactured, it's grown on molasses and other things. It's dried, it's vacuum packaged, and then shipped. It currently has a 2-year shelf life as long as the package hasn't been opened. Usage level, if you see some of the very old recipes that are out there or formulations that are out there, compressed yeast was always the yeast that we started with. They didn't make instant yeast when I started doing this, so we used block yeast. They did make active dry though, because that was made back World War II-ish, but we'll talk about that now. It's dried at a lower temperature for a longer period of time to try to put a protective coating on the yeast itself. It was so we could ship it to the GIs overseas without damaging it. The thing that they had to do was actually soak it in warm water to get the activity or get the moisture into the live yeast cells that's in there. Generally, rehydration is done between 100 and 110 degrees. That's a rough estimate. Does everybody use thermometers in your shops? I like that, and it's getting better. Anybody try to use a laser or a pointy type thermometer? Digitals kind of work okay for checking oven temperatures and header temperatures on cars. They don't work much on water. They definitely don't work on dough because they only take the outer 1,000th of a millimeter for temperature. So just be careful with it. There's a lot more dead yeast cells in active dry than there are live yeast cells. So yeast, when it dies off, tends to allow the dough to relax more. It doesn't have as much gassing power to it. But because as yeast dies, it imparts this yeastier flavor profile to it. If you like active dry, and apparently this group does, which is kind of awesome, just make sure you're rehydrating the yeast so that you don't have that effect where one day it works awesome and the next day it doesn't work so awesome. It works kind of maybe. Yes?
I forget where I read. I think it was in the flour, salt, water, yeast book a bit. So at least it was somewhere they were talking about now the way that they make it is a little bit different in that if you're making it with the dough and you put it in a dough that's already like hydrated, that that should be enough to thoughts on that?
My thoughts are not so much in accordance with that. Hydrating active dry yeast is going to give you a much more consistent product from day to day. The thing that you keep in mind is in bread making, you're probably going to mix the dough somewhere between 10 and 15, 16 minutes. And you're going to mix it in high speed or medium speed at least. When you're making pizza doughs, you can be mixing as short as 4 or 5 minutes and all the way up to maybe 8 or 9. Rarely do they go much higher than that unless you're mixing 50 pounds of dough or 50 pounds of flour in a 60-quart mixer in speed 1. It's not adding a whole lot of energy to that dough at that speed. So I'd stick with rehydrating if you can. Instant, however, you can just add right to the flour and it'll be fine. Compressed yeast. We got 10 minutes to boogie. Compressed yeast is basically what all the other yeasts are before they get to that stage. Compressed yeast is actually run through what looks like a pasta machine or a spaghetti machine, very minute holes, and then it's dried. Most of it's done in various different dryers, but it's dried down so that there's only about 4 or 5% moisture in it. Compressed yeast is the beginning of all of that. So it's in block form, or it's molded into block forms from liquid yeast. Anybody know how long it takes to make yeast? That's kind of a weird one. It takes about a week. That's awesome. Nobody ever knows that answer. The yeast that they start with is about maybe a gram or 2. After about 7 to 10 days, that can reach about 600,000 pounds of liquid. It is a voracious consumer of food. Formula ranges. We're going to give these to you in baker's percent because I don't know how to do 100% stuff. And I like it better that way. Flour is going to always be 100%. Your water range, depending on the type of crust you're going to try to produce, is going to vary somewhere in that 45 to 65% range, which means for 100 pounds of flour, you're going to have somewhere between 45 and 65 pounds of water in your recipe. Salt levels usually run somewhere around 1 to 2.5%. The average is, for most pizzerias, is around 1.75 to 2. So, sugar. You don't have to have sugar to make dough for pizza. There is enough starch in flour that can be converted to sugars that the yeast can feed on. Oil. I don't always add oil. If I'm doing a Neapolitan pizza, I never add oil. If I'm doing a Chicago deep dish pizza, I have seen levels as high as 23% corn oil. That's a lot of oil. I mean, that makes a dough that is really hard to handle. But it's not going to dry out. Yeast, like I was saying earlier, yeast levels usually around 0.25 to 3.0. That gives you the entire gamut of both instant, active dry, and compressed. Oh, basic dough formulations. Here's our technical disclaimer. If your dough is working for you with the recipe that you're currently following, don't fix stuff that ain't broke. We're not trying to make you do that. We're not even trying to suggest that you do that. But if you don't have a formula right now and you need something, here's a good starting point. New York style pizzas, 100% flour, mostly high gluten, 56 to 61%, 62% absorption for water, salts around 2%, sugars at 1, maybe, oil levels usually around 4 to 5, and an instant yeast, this says 0.75, and I need to fix that because that is seriously wrong. It should be somewhere in that 0.25 to 0.50 range. Pan dough. That also covers deep, slightly thicker crust, full-size pizzas that you're running through a conveyor oven, you're running through any kind of a deck oven, it doesn't matter. 100% water, or 100% flour. 53 is a little low, but 54 to 58 is a pretty good range to work in. Depends on how long you're going to refrigerate the dough ball. Sugar, a little bit higher than what you get with New York style, at 2. Oil levels usually around 6%, which is 6 pounds of oil and 100 pounds of flour. And then yeast levels, probably somewhere in that 0.50 to 1%, depending on how long you're refrigerating for. The key to remember about refrigerating dough balls and extending the shelf life of a dough ball in refrigerated format is the more yeast you add, the shorter the shelf life. Because it's not a baby. You can't feed it more food after you've mixed the dough. You're not going to give it a bottle. You're not going to feed it baby food out of a jar or anything like that. You're going to actually need to have a way to feed that yeast, or it will cannibalize itself and destroy the dough. The older the dough gets, the worse it will become. And it will get to the point where it will stick to pretty much everything on the planet. And it will turn gray and get funny little black spots all over it. That's usually way too much yeast that has started to mess with the bran in the flour. That usually happens about day 1.5 if you're using about twice as much yeast as you should be. But it can go out to 3 or 4 or 5 days sometimes without affecting anything in the spots. Deep dish doughs. And that's not referring specifically to Chicago style deep dish. It's referring to a deeper dish type of pizza. 1.25 inch height to the pan, whatever it is you're going to do. Almost always all-purpose flour or a version of all-purpose flour, whether you want to blend it with something like bread flour or all-purpose, that's fine. You're going to have 100 pounds of that. The water level is slightly elevated at about 56 to 60%. You want to be able to stretch it and push it up the sides of the pan. Salt levels usually at about 1.5, sugar at about 2.5. Oil levels slightly higher because you want that lubrication in the dough itself to allow it to stretch the way it should. And then the yeast level's fairly low. You want a longer fermentation for a better flavor profile. Cracker doughs, all-purpose, 100% flour, slightly lower amount of water or absorption. So you're at about 50, I've seen as low as 46. Salt levels at 2, sugar levels pretty high. You want the yeast to consume a lot of food. And the oil level's usually at about 2% because you don't want it to be over lubricated. And then the yeast level's fairly high because you want to actually work that dough to the point where it's kind of desiccating itself. Neapolitan dough is usually 100% flour, 60 to 64% on water. Sugar or salt level is usually about 2 1/4. We don't ever add sugar or salt or oil because you don't want to damage the deck. Your deck is there for a reason. It's your main source of heat. And the yeast level is fairly low. It's down around, if I make yeasted doughs at the lab or at the culinary center, I'm usually running about 0.1% yeast. And then I'll let the dough set for a couple days.
Which would you recommend for these?
I can give you a Sicilian style formula later, but I don't have it right off the top of my head. Okay? Yes?
So people say that water makes a difference in pizza making, like through your dough. Is that true? Then it works for beers. I worked at breweries in Colorado for a few years. In San Diego, there's places like this ship water ship all the way from New York, and it's the only way to make pizza. Is it a personal thing, or is it actual thing? Because the minerals in the water actually make the meat taste better differently?
Well, the sad part is New York hasn't won the water competition in a long time. It's Fresno, of all places in the world. And I still can't figure that out because I've worked in Fresno a lot, and it didn't work for me. But there's some truth to that. If you're using softened water, horrible idea. It actually has a huge negative effect on the quality of the pizza. But if you're just using the tap water that you have, you can have the local water company send you the data that you need on it. You can give me a call and I can try to help you through that. If you need to make adjustments, there are all sorts of fermentation aids that can be added to pizza to get the water about to where you want it. If you have other questions about it, the simplest way to do it is put in a reverse osmosis system and increase the salt level slightly. Most of the large chains have either put in RO systems or put in filtration, carbon filtration systems to get specifically the chlorine out of it.
Is there some kind of ratio if you're using sourdough starter instead of commercial yeast?
There is. It's really too much of a variety because the actual location where the sour started has an effect on the way it functions. So I would recommend actually that you talk to the artisan guys. They can help you a lot. Craig Ponsford is one that's there right now. He's one of the main characters from the Bread Bakers Guild. He'd be more than happy to talk to you. Craig Ponsford.
You hadn't talked on using beer as well. Does that have yeast? Does that change some of
the yeast is pretty much dead in beer, by the way. But there's a lot of it used in making beer. I did a project for 12 months on trying to make a beer pizza.
I put IPA in my dough.
Yeah, I put everything from Falstaff to Guinness.
Yeah.
The live yeast that's going in there actually dissipates most of the flavor. I would prefer just drinking the beer and just going for it. Don't waste it. Don't waste it on the dough.
What about malt?
Malt? Most of our flours are malted. Not all. There's a lot of enzymes being used nowadays. If you want a really strong malty flavor, you'd probably want to use non-diastatic malt, which means the enzyme's been destroyed. If you want to use malt as a food for the yeast, you want to keep it below about 0.5 to 0.75% on the flour. But it can add good flavor.
And that's why I use the IPA because it pops.
Yeah, my wife drinks the IPAs. I just stick to vodka. It's supposed to be diet stuff. We're pretty much done here, but there is a gluten-free pizza dough in this booklet that you have.
Yeah,
If you follow it to a T, it actually makes a pretty decent gluten-free crust, but it's a par-baked crust. You have to bake it before you freeze it. Quite frankly, for the amount of energy that I had to put into this formula, I'd probably go out and buy gluten-free crusts. Just be very, very careful when you're doing gluten-free stuff. Make sure that your utensils, your gloves, everything is in a different room if you can. Don't take any chances with gluten. It can be very harmful to those that are true celiacs. So that's pretty much it for now. We'll be back at 3:30. If anybody has any questions and you weren't comfortable asking them out in the open like with all the rest of these people, thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here. Hope we can help.